Today we're talking about something a lot of men quietly struggle with but rarely admit out loud: how to treat a woman who took you for granted. And before we go any deeper, I want to be very clear. This isn't about hurting anyone or getting revenge. It's about understanding yourself, valuing your emotional well-being, and learning what to do when someone didn't appreciate the love, time, or presence you offered. Welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you're here because this conversation is uncomfortable, honest, and necessary. In my work as a therapist, I've sat across from countless men, strong, patient, generous, who found themselves asking the same quiet question: why wasn't I enough for her to treat me right? And every time I hear it, I can feel the weight behind it. It's not anger, it's not bitterness, it's the disappointment of giving more than you received. Here's the controversial part. A woman taking you for granted isn't always about her. Sometimes it's about the version of yourself you abandoned just to keep her comfortable. Sometimes it's about seeing her needs so clearly that you stopped noticing your own. And sometimes it's about staying silent even when everything inside you felt disrespected or dismissed. I'm not saying this to blame you or excuse her. I'm saying it because healing starts with honesty. And treating someone who took you for granted requires you to first understand how you allowed yourself to be treated. As a therapist, I can't tell you how many times I've watched a man wake up to the reality that he was showing up for someone who barely showed up for him. That moment hits hard, but it also changes everything. In this video, we're going to break this down step by step. You'll learn how to reclaim your self-respect, how to set boundaries that actually stick, and how to move forward without carrying resentment. This isn't about punishing her. It's about choosing yourself in a way you didn't before. Let's get into it. 1. Recognizing where you lost yourself. When I talk to men about being taken for granted, this is always the first place we start. Recognizing where you slowly, quietly lost pieces of yourself without even noticing. And I want you to stay with me here, because this isn't about blaming yourself or carrying guilt. It's about understanding the moments where you stopped honoring your needs just to hold on to someone who wasn't holding on to you the same way. Every man I've worked with who felt taken for granted had a moment, sometimes small, sometimes obvious, where he began to shrink so she could feel comfortable. Maybe you stopped speaking up because you didn't want to argue. Maybe you ignored your own boundaries because you thought being flexible would make things easier. Maybe you put her moods, her needs, her wants above your own because you believed that loving someone meant sacrificing your voice. And before you knew it, you weren't showing up as the man you truly are. You were showing up as the man you hoped would finally be appreciated. I've seen this pattern in my sessions so many times that I can almost hear it before a client finishes the sentence. A man will say, "I don't know what happened. At the beginning, she liked me exactly as I was." And I'll gently ask, "When did you stop being that man?" There's always a pause, a long one, because most of the time, the change didn't happen overnight. It happened through tiny compromises that felt harmless at first. But those small compromises added up until you barely recognized yourself anymore. The reason this part is so important is because you can't treat someone differently until you understand what part of you allowed the situation to happen in the first place. Recognizing where you lost yourself isn't about weakness. It's about reclaiming your emotional clarity. It's about acknowledging that somewhere along the way, you traded authenticity for approval. And every time a man does that, he teaches the other person, without realizing it, that his needs are optional. I remember guiding someone through this exact realization. He kept saying, "She walked all over me." But when we peeled back the layers, he realized he'd been handing her the map. Letting things slide became a habit. Avoiding conflict became normal. And once he saw that, everything changed, not because he wanted to punish her, but because he finally understood himself again. This section is about that moment of honesty with yourself, recognizing the emotional truth you might have ignored, asking yourself when you stopped expressing your boundaries, your expectations, your worth. Once you see that clearly, a shift happens, not in her, but in you. And that shift is what makes the rest of this process possible. Because the first step to treating a woman who took you for granted is simply recognizing the moment you stopped treating yourself with the respect you deserved. Once you reclaim that, everything else becomes much clearer. 2. Understanding the pattern of being taken for granted when men come to me and tell me a woman took them for granted, they usually focus on the final moment, the disappointment, the disrespect, the shift in her behavior. But the truth is, the pattern starts long before the moment you finally feel the sting. It starts quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. That's why understanding the pattern is so important. Once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. And that clarity changes how you show up in every relationship moving forward. Being taken for granted rarely happens because a woman suddenly stops caring. More often, it happens because she gradually learns that you'll always be there, no matter how she shows up. She learns you'll tolerate more than you should. She learns your love is steady even when her effort isn't. And while consistency is a beautiful trait, it can become a dangerous one when it's not paired with boundaries. One thing I often remind men of is this: people respond to what you allow. I've seen this pattern unfold over and over in my sessions. A man starts out confident, independent, and self-respecting. She's drawn to that energy. It's clear, it's grounded, it's attractive. But then, slowly, he begins to shift. Maybe he starts saying yes to things he doesn't actually want. Maybe he starts prioritizing her in ways she never asked for, but never objected to. Maybe he stops doing the things that made him feel strong, fulfilled, and balanced. And here's the interesting part. She doesn't usually notice the shift right away. It's not intentional. She's not sitting there thinking, how can I take advantage of him today? It's more subtle than that. She begins to grow comfortable. She begins to expect the version of you that always bends, always forgives, always makes the effort. And once comfort becomes expectation, appreciation fades. I've talked to many men who tell me, she used to admire how independent I was, or she used to tell me she loved how disciplined I am. And somewhere along the line, they traded those qualities for constant availability. And here's a hard truth many men don't want to face. When you stop living like the man she was originally drawn to, the dynamic shifts. You become predictable in a way that no longer inspires respect. I remember speaking with someone who realized he had fallen into a pattern of overgiving. He wasn't doing it out of love anymore. He was doing it out of fear. Fear of losing her. Fear of disappointing her. Fear of not being enough. And once your actions come from fear, you unconsciously teach the other person to value you less. Understanding this pattern isn't about shame. It's about education. It's about recognizing the early signs so you never repeat them. When you see how the pattern forms, tiny compromises, fear-based decisions, emotional overextension, you can stop it before it grows into something that leaves you feeling drained and unappreciated. Because once a man understands this pattern, he doesn't just change how he's treated, he changes how he treats himself. And that shift is everything. 3. Learning to respond instead of react. One of the biggest shifts I try to teach men, both in my sessions and in real-life situations, is the difference between reacting and responding. And if you've ever felt taken for granted by a woman, this is the turning point that separates men who regain their power from men who stay stuck in emotional chaos. Reacting is instant, raw, and usually driven by pain. Responding is intentional, grounded, and driven by clarity. And that difference changes everything. When a man feels unappreciated, ignored, or disrespected, the first instinct is almost always emotional. Maybe you get angry. Maybe you shut down. Maybe you start arguing or trying to prove your worth. Maybe you pull away, not because it's healthy, but because you want her to feel what you're feeling. I've seen every reaction imaginable, and I understand them. They're human. But they rarely lead anywhere meaningful. Most of the time, they only deepen the wound. Responding, on the other hand, requires you to pause long enough to understand what you're really feeling and what outcome you actually want. I remember talking with someone who always reacted the moment he felt dismissed. He'd say something sharp, or he'd ghost her for a day, or he'd become overly emotional. But every time after the reaction faded, he felt worse. Not because she won or because he lost, but because the reaction didn't reflect the man he wanted to be. I guided him through a simple shift. Take a breath before you engage. Not to calm yourself down, though that helps, but to give your mind a moment to catch up with your emotions. Because your emotions speak loudly, but your clarity speaks correctly. Once he learned to respond instead of react, the entire dynamic changed. She stopped treating him like a man who could be pushed into emotional corners and started seeing him as someone who handled himself with control and maturity. When you learn to respond, you stop letting your emotions dictate your behavior. You stop proving yourself, explaining yourself, defending yourself. Instead, you communicate from a place of self-respect. Maybe your response sounds like, "I'm not comfortable with that," or "I don't appreciate being spoken to that way," or even silence when the situation doesn't deserve your energy. A response doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. It just needs to be intentional. And here's something a lot of men don't realize. Responding instead of reacting makes you far more attractive, not because it's a game, but because emotional composure is a rare and respected trait. People treat you differently when they see you don't operate from impulse. Learning to respond is you reclaiming control over your emotional world. It's choosing dignity over chaos. It's choosing clarity over confusion. And most importantly, it's choosing yourself over the temporary satisfaction of a heated reaction. This is where your power begins to return. 4. Creating emotional distance without hostility. When I talk to men about creating emotional distance, many tense up immediately. They imagine it as cold, cruel, or manipulative. But emotional distance isn't about punishing someone. It's about protecting yourself. And to make this clear, I want to share a situation I once walked a client through without revealing anything personal, of course. He was in a relationship where he constantly felt dismissed, not in loud, obvious ways, but in the quiet moments, the forgotten check-ins, the lack of appreciation, the way his feelings were brushed off like they were small, and he reacted the way many men do. He tried harder, he gave more attention, he became extra patient, he softened his tone, he waited for her to notice. The more she pulled away, the more he leaned in. And all it did was push the dynamic even further out of balance. One day, he came to me exhausted, not angry, tired, emotionally drained. He told me, "I don't want to fight her, but I can't keep doing this." And that's when we talked about emotional distance, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. Creating emotional distance simply means you stop giving someone access to the parts of you they haven't earned. You stop offering your time, your energy, your vulnerability on demand. You stop centering your world around their moods, their reactions, their inconsistencies. You don't shut down, you just stop overextending. For my client, the shift was small but powerful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't become distant out of spite. He simply rebalanced his emotional investment. If she was cold, he didn't melt himself trying to warm the space. If she was distracted, he didn't chase her attention. If she canceled plans, he didn't sacrifice his own schedule just to reschedule instantly. He didn't withdraw love, he withdrew urgency. The change was subtle, but she felt it. Not because he was playing games, but because he stopped making her the center of decisions she wasn't fully showing up for. Suddenly, she had to meet him where he was instead of expecting him to carry the emotional load. And here's the important lesson. Emotional distance isn't about shutting someone out. It's about giving them the space to show their true interest, effort, and respect. When you stop filling every gap, you finally see whether they step forward or step away. Men often fear that distance will push her further, but forced closeness often does that more. Giving space, calmly, deliberately, allows both of you to breathe. It allows her to notice your absence in the areas where she once took your presence for granted. And it allows you to reconnect with yourself instead of constantly monitoring her behavior. The real power in emotional distance is that it resets the dynamic. It protects your heart without hardening it. It reminds her you're a person with boundaries, not an emotional vending machine. And most importantly, it puts you back in control of your own well-being, which is exactly where you belong. 5. Rebuilding your self-worth from the inside out. When a woman takes a man for granted, one of the first things to crumble, often silently, is his self-worth. And I've seen this happen countless times in relationships. A man starts out strong, grounded, confident, and somewhere along the line, the way he's treated begins to reshape the way he sees himself. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, like erosion. That's why rebuilding your self-worth isn't just important. It's essential. I remember working with someone who had been in a long relationship where he constantly felt like he was never quite enough. He tried to be patient, supportive, understanding. He listened more than he spoke. He forgave things he shouldn't have. He lowered his expectations because he didn't want to come across as demanding. And eventually, he told me something I've heard in different forms from so many men. I think I lost myself trying to keep her happy. And that's exactly what happens when you're repeatedly taken for granted. Your identity starts bending towards someone else's comfort, and before you even notice, your confidence becomes dependent on their approval. So when she pulls away, dismisses your efforts, or stops valuing what you bring to the relationship, the blow lands much deeper than disappointment. It shakes your entire sense of worth. Rebuilding that self-worth starts with reclaiming the parts of you that you abandoned. In my client's case, we began with reconnecting him to the things that once made him feel strong and alive. He used to lift weights consistently, but he stopped because he was always available for her. He used to spend time with friends, but he drifted away to avoid conflict. He used to have a vision for his own life, but he let it fade while prioritizing hers. So we rebuilt one brick at a time. He started showing up to the gym again, not for validation, but for himself. He started reconnecting with people who supported him. He picked up hobbies he had shelved. And the most important part, he relearned how to speak to himself with respect. Because you can't rebuild self-worth with self-criticism. You rebuild it by treating yourself the way you wish others had treated you. The moment he started pouring energy back into himself, something shifted. His posture changed, his tone changed, even the way he looked at himself changed. And without him trying to prove anything, the dynamic with his partner shifted too. She began noticing things she had overlooked. She saw the strength returning. She saw the boundaries forming, not because he demanded recognition, but because he wasn't living from a place of emotional depletion anymore. Self-worth doesn't come from being chosen, appreciated, or validated by someone else. It comes from recognizing your own value, whether they see it or not. Rebuilding it means reminding yourself that your worth doesn't decrease when someone fails to acknowledge it. It means separating your identity from someone else's ability to appreciate you. When you rebuild your self-worth from the inside out, you stop chasing respect and start attracting it. 6. Showing her the new boundaries, not explaining them. One of the biggest turning points for any man who's been taken for granted is learning how to show boundaries instead of explaining them. And I want you to really lean into this because it's one of the most powerful shifts I've watched men make. Not with anger, not with pride, but with maturity and self-respect. Here's the thing most men don't realize. When you explain a boundary over and over, it stops sounding like a boundary and starts sounding like a request. And when you ask for respect instead of demonstrating it, the dynamic stays exactly the same. I've seen this pattern too many times. Men trying to talk their way into being valued, trying to negotiate fairness, trying to convince a woman to treat them differently. But healthy boundaries aren't spoken into existence. They're lived. I once spoke to someone who kept telling his partner, "I don't like being spoken to that way," or "I need more effort from you." And every time he said it, she'd nod, apologize, or promise to change, but nothing actually changed. Eventually, he asked me, "Why doesn't she take my boundaries seriously?" And the answer was simple. He kept saying them, but he never held them. There was no consequence, no shift in behavior, no adjustment in how he showed up. The words were there, but the follow-through wasn't. So we worked on changing that. Instead of repeating himself, he began acting from the place his boundaries lived. When she spoke to him disrespectfully, he didn't argue. He ended the conversation calmly and continued it later when the energy was better. When she made last-minute demands, he didn't drop everything for her. He prioritized his schedule and said, "I'm available at this time instead." When she gave minimal effort, he stopped compensating with extra effort of his own. And here's what happened. She took notice, not because he lectured her into understanding, but because she could see the difference in his behavior. Boundaries became visible, consistent, real. And for the first time, she understood that the relationship wasn't operating on her terms alone. Women don't respect boundaries because they're explained well. They respect boundaries because they're demonstrated consistently. Showing a boundary means your actions mirror your standards. It means you stop letting emotions pull you back into old patterns. It means you choose self-respect even when it feels uncomfortable. And most importantly, it means you stop trying to manage her reactions and focus on managing your decisions. And here's the powerful part. Once you show a boundary, you don't need to raise your voice, defend yourself, or give long speeches. Your behavior speaks for you. Your silence speaks for you. Your consistency speaks for you. The moment a man lives his boundaries, the relationship dynamic shifts naturally, not through argument, but through clarity. Because when she can see the line instead of being told about it, she finally understands the difference between the man she took for granted and the man who now values himself. 7. Choosing the life that values you back. There comes a point in every man's healing where the focus shifts from her behavior to his future. And this final step, choosing the life that values you back, is where everything you've learned finally comes together. Because once a woman has taken you for granted and you've rebuilt yourself, you reach a crossroads. Do you slip back into the old version of the relationship, or do you build a life where you're truly valued? I once guided someone through this exact turning point. He had spent months working on himself after feeling overlooked, dismissed, and emotionally drained in his relationship. He regained his confidence, rebuilt his routine, reconnected with friends, and even pursued goals he had abandoned. But when his partner began noticing this new version of him, she suddenly wanted to re-engage, to reconnect, to pull him back into the familiar dynamic. And he sat across from me and asked, "Should I go back?" Not with anger, not with ego, just confusion. Because men who return to themselves often forget this one truth. Once you grow, you don't fit back into the same space you outgrew. Choosing a life that values you back doesn't always mean leaving her. It means refusing to leave yourself ever again. It means making decisions based on your worth, not your fear. It means keeping the standards you rebuilt, even when emotions rise and familiarity tries to pull you backward. For my client, we didn't talk about what she wanted. We talked about whether the life he was creating aligned with the man he had become. And when you look at it from that angle, the picture becomes much clearer. He realized that if she wanted to be part of his life again, she needed to meet him where he stood, not where he used to kneel. Choosing the life that values you back means continuing to invest in yourself even when someone else suddenly becomes interested again. It means staying committed to your growth even if it makes others uncomfortable. It means surrounding yourself with people who appreciate effort, communication, honesty, and consistency, not just when they feel like giving it, but as a standard. It also means accepting something many men avoid. Sometimes the lesson wasn't about her at all. Sometimes the lesson was about finally seeing your own value, finally recognizing your patterns, finally choosing yourself unapologetically. The most engaging part of this journey is the transformation that follows. When a man truly values himself, he begins attracting people who naturally do the same. Connections become healthier, boundaries become normal, emotional peace becomes the baseline, and the life he builds stops depending on someone else's approval. Choosing the life that values you back is the moment you stop chasing validation and start choosing alignment. It's the moment you realize that being taken for granted once doesn't define your future, unless you allow it to. It's the moment you finally say, "I deserve better," and then live in a way that proves it. When a woman takes you for granted, the real healing isn't about fixing her. It's about finding yourself again. Every step in this journey leads you back to your own value, your own voice, and your own boundaries. You learn where you lost yourself, how the pattern formed, and how to respond with clarity instead of emotion. You rebuild your confidence, you create healthier distance, and you show your new standards through action, not arguments. And in the end, you don't chase validation. You choose a life that reflects your worth. Because the moment you value yourself, everything around you begins to shift.